My name is Kaliya Young. I'm also known online as Identity Woman. And we're going to today tackle this question. It's a big one. Who owns identity? And in our discussions leading up to this panel, there was a naming of like why this is a value. Like it seems like if you've been paying attention to identity for a long time, these questions never go away. And if you're new, you're starting to engage them. But the reason we need to continue to engage them, and they were named this morning on one of the other panels, is that there's so many different new kind of sectors figuring out identity that's an issue. We need to be in a room together having these philosophical conversations, and that in fact the fundamental design and construction of all the systems that are being discussed here is informed by their philosophical worldview. So that's why it's important. It's not just to talk about it for its own sake, it's because it will inform how these whole systems and meta-systems and meta-meta-systems all get built. So I want to dive right in and get our panelists both to say hello to you and also tell you what they think about the question, the answer to the question. What are our rights to our digital identities? And I was going to start with Shireen at the end and go this way.
You jumped on me right away. Okay, so my name is Shireen Mitchell. I'm the founder, actually, in Washington, D.C. I'm the first woman of color that formed a web firm dealing with online access. I also founded Digital Sistas, an organization focused on getting women and girls of color into tech and online and about their identities. And right now I'm working on stopping online violence against women, which is actually a growth of that work I've been doing over this time. So the importance of identity for me, first of all, I think that sometimes we forget the fact that it's also based in who we are, that my identity is literally who I am sitting right here on this stage, but it's also the work that I've done and why that work is important and how we look at this over time, not only from the industry itself, but as our identities evolve and where it goes from there. So from my personal opinion, my identity is me, and I should have the right to it, no matter what happens, and it does not get defined by anyone else.
Cool, thanks. Brad?
Hi, my name is Brad. I'm the CEO of Mooti. We have a blockchain-based digital identity, self-sovereign based solution that we're deploying in different industries like healthcare and banking for authentication and access management. But also, it gets to this question about who owns identity. And we looked at different models around the world for what, how do we replicate in sort of the digital realm, identity, right? And we prescribe to this model of federated and attested identities that are owned by the user. I actually believe the question, who owns identity, is sort of rhetorical. I think you should own your own identity. But the real trick is, how do you make that compatible with like all the digital technology we have today? And I think, it's sort of a double-edged sword. We have like all these cool computers and databases, and now we have blockchain technology and cryptography and all these really interesting things. But how do we actually, empower a consumer directly to have control of his or her identity? I think that's really at the root of the problem that we're all trying to solve. And we all have different mechanisms for how we interpret that. I like to have self-sovereign identity at the user level, at the mobile device level, and you're going to hear from some other panelists on their views too. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. Jamie.
Hi, I'm Jamie Williams. I'm a staff attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a digital rights nonprofit based in San Francisco. I'm on their civil liberties team, so I focus on free speech and privacy work. And yeah, I agree. I think the question, who owns identity, is a weird one. It's like the wrong one. That's fine. That's what this panel is about.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, because it's like, I agree with you. It seems like a really weird rhetorical question to ask because, like, of course, like, identity is me, but like, it's also when you're talking about online. What do you mean? What do we mean when we're talking about online identity? And I think we're talking about like all this data that's collected about us online, some of which we're aware about, some of which we're not aware about. It's increasingly including more and more data from biometric space. All this stuff, it's all about me, and I want the right to control that. And for EFF, the right to control that isn't it's not like a voluntary participation thing where like I chose to participate and then that's it, I'm done. So that's not like sufficient for us to a right is like your ability that cannot be taken away from the company to control what's happening with your data, know what's happening with it, stop things happening with it, be able to let other people use it when you want them to, etc. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.
My name is Matt Hogan. I'm the founder and CEO of Datacoup. Datacoup is a personal data marketplace. It's a platform for individuals like all of us to effectively aggregate and share, sell, or exchange our data in return for direct value or compensation, with the basic premise being all of us create mountains of increasingly valuable data on our browser, on our phones, on our bank accounts, on our Fitbits, all over the place. And most of it is being logged digitally. And right now we don't have much control over that, that data that's being created. And we certainly are not the chief beneficiaries of the economic value of that data. And we're trying to change that paradigm with our company. I won't disagree with anything that anybody on the panel said to answer this question so far, and I'll try to piggyback on it. I said to Kaliya, in some of the intro conversations that we've had, I tend not to think of identity in the framework of ownership. I always think of ownership as being constructed for the physical world, and especially from a legal perspective, for individual property rights, et cetera. So, I'm the only person sitting in this chair right now, and you could potentially say that I'm exhibiting ownership qualities over this chair. I didn't purchase it. This is being rented from the venue, but for all intents and purposes, I'm the only person in the world sitting in this chair right now. Data is a little bit different in so much as it can exist in two different places at once. So if I swipe my debit or credit card at Starbucks, the fact that I paid $3.25 for a coffee exists on my receipt. It can also exist in Starbucks POS system. It's some DMP that Starbucks uses, all these different places. So I like to think of it, identity, of course, is either the hub or the spokes or the data, or, nucleus and nodes identity and the data, potentially for another analogy. I like to think of the control over the distribution of the nodes as being kind of the key piece, and becoming the chief beneficiary of whatever value is generated from doing that. And it may or may not be a rights thing, but certainly we're all in a catbird seat knowing that we're, I don't know if this is really provable, but, from when I was born in 1981, like, my identity is really just like the persistence of me a long time. And that means I'm going to have the best look at all the the authenticity of data that I'm creating, things that I'm doing, my preferences, my sentiments, et cetera. So whether or not it's a rights thing or ownership thing, if someone's going to transact with me, it's advantageous for them to be listening to me either in physical form or in the digital world. So I guess the challenge, and Brad mentioned before, is how do we link the physical world and the digital world, and all of the technology that's being created, cryptography and distributed ledger technology, hopefully lends itself to bridging that gap, which to date has been really challenging.
Wow. Okay. So there's lots of material to keep going. You want jump in?
No, but
Jump in.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. So, we touched on this question of who owns identity, which is sort of like, maybe it's the wrong question, which I tend to agree with. But what are our rights to our digital identity? And that's a slightly different take on it. Like, how do we unpack, that?
I think I started to answer that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it really depends what you mean by rights. Like, are you talking about the legal rights that exist today, or the rights that we should have, or like the human rights, right? So like, there's a lot of different contexts. There's not a lot of actual laws that give consumers like real legal rights in this country, right now. But I think like as the EFF as an advocacy organization wants users to have more rights and feels like we should have rights and things. So we're advocating for rights in that way. So yeah, it really depends what you're talking about when you mean rights.
Okay, so what do we mean?
Well, I think that's the question, because right now, as we talk about all these pieces, there's plenty of data that we don't have control over. So in that essence, do we have the right to that data, and how can we acquire it? And is that something we should have? And that's that's the question that I think Jamie's bringing up, is where's the line, and how much power do we have to go demand that data because it's ours?
So I'm going to jump in, and those are great comments on rights. If we get down sort of the legal path that Jamie brought up, I think it can get a little in and over our heads around that discussion, just because, especially, we can just focus on the U.S., but if we look internationally, I mean, the landscape is so varied across what happens, and even within the U.S., we see that changing very rapidly, as we have, recently with, some recent decisions on super cookies and stuff that, that ISPs can do with, collected data. When I look at data rights, I actually break data into two different components. We generate data with business partners at sort of a commercial level, and we often sign like terms and conditions with those business partners that oftentimes use that data to try to customize services to better serve us. I'm sort of okay with that. Like, you go to Amazon and they, check what types of stuff you like to buy, so they recommend things that you might want to buy when you go back. I'm pretty cool with that in general as a consumer, but then like having them package that up and then selling it to somebody else without really me knowing about it, I'm not really so cool with that, but I think it happens more than we actually realize. Yeah. And so like this transmission of like generated data that's valuable, Matt's company is trying to do something to give that more user control, around that. But I think there's another layer of sort of identity data and rights that exist, that's sort of this intermediary layer that we don't talk about today, but it exists within the digital realm. And that's more of like attested or reputational based data. And I think if we move more to leveraging attestations or reputational data in some of our transactions with merchants or retailers or other businesses online, it sort of becomes a moot point around privacy as long as we're not transmitting static data. And so I think, our company is focusing a lot on that. So I see some inquisitive faces. So just really, really quick, as an example, when you want to buy alcohol at a store or at a bar, a bartender or someone at the checkout counter will ask you for your ID so that they can check if your age is 21 and over. But they don't really need to see any of that other data on your ID. They don't need to know what state you're from. They don't need to actually know your birth date. They just need to know that you're 21 and over and you're legally allowed to buy alcohol. So what we can do is have the state attest to the fact through a digital certificate that you are actually of legal age without de-identifying all the other really sensitive information. And so we want to move away from static identification processes to reputational or digital certificate attestation-based processes for identification and validation. And I think that will sort of change sort of the paradigm of like information security and like who needs to own what data as we start to move towards less static data transmission.
So I think one of the things, there's a layer cake of identity too, and we've discussed it, but we haven't necessarily named it here. There's sort of there's identifiers and sort of pointers at us, like social security numbers or even phone numbers. They point at us, and some of them are communication endpoints. There's another set of things, which is things we volunteer. So we know that we posted a tweet, and we understand we put a photo on Flickr or whatever media we're using. But there's also, and in some ways, we know we do a transaction, right? Like we pulled out our credit card and we bought that coffee at Starbucks, but we don't think about how far that little data breadcrumb goes into these networks, consciously, particularly. And we also aren't thinking about all of this new law about like ISPs can suck up all of our surfing data and like resell it. Like, but we're not conscious of that observed data about our activities that all these different services have. So I think there's a stack of things that become and can be thought of as identity, but they're not always named, and sometimes they all blur together. And we need to maybe not necessarily have different conversations about each of them, but remember they're not all the same thing. So,
Can I quickly mention just
Go ahead.
before we get off rights, just one thing that kind of bumps heads with identity in terms of your rights and just being online is anonymity, and especially in relation to speech. So like the ability to speak online without anyone knowing who you are, and the idea that you'll be tracked everywhere you go online really it threatens that in a way that I think some people probably think is good. Like, anonymous speech is also like a foundational thing in this country. Like the Federalist Papers were published anonymously, right? So, so that's just like something that butt heads, like your right to go online and be non-identified too.
we don't have to leave rights right away. It's okay.
I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah.
The little free speech lawyer in me was like, don't forget about this.
No.
Anyway.
Just to maybe to add a little bit too, with regards to rights, or if rights are hard to transfer from the physical world into the digital world, or rights for whatever reason are insufficiently taking care of problems that we've seen grow and metastasize in the marketplace, online especially. Maybe an example that would be someone like, and no offense for anyone in the room from the data brokers, but let's say Axiom. So for example, Axiom, largest data broker in the country, publicly traded stock. They openly brag on their website of having 1,500 plus data elements about 250 million U.S. adults or something along those lines. And most people outside of this conference, if you walk around New York City and ask someone, do you know what Axiom is, or do you know who they are? Most people have no idea, right? It's just a very obscure company aggregating a lot of information about us. Now, if there are safe and secure ways using an undergirding architecture like what Brad is working on, or other folks here at the conference, and there's a marketplace set up where you can use tools as an individual, and we're employing some of the principles of self-sovereign identity, then there's a way to pass data to the same entities or corporations or companies that are already buying data from Axiom. Let's say we find ways to like Gap may go buy data from Axiom about leads, and then there's a way that says, you know what, I'm using all this really cool new technology, and I want to pass myself off as a lead to Gap because I like them. I'm in the market for a pair of pants, and maybe there's a reverse bidding process going on, and I can do this safely and securely. That's a way that we can potentially bypass a legal framework or rights and effectively deleverage actors in the market who aren't, I'm not saying they're doing illegal things, but things that are surreptitious or not done with our consent. I'm trying to suggest that there's a way to using technology in markets to bypass a lot of the poor activity that happens out there. I think we're starting to chip away at the beginning of that. But it feels like from where I sit, we can see a path towards going down that road with what's available to us now.
Cool. Sometimes I think about that as getting through the wormhole. Like there's the debate ends up getting framed as privacy and like stop all business as we know it, or leave everything alone in the sort of crazy wild west of like just sharing everything about everybody. And we need to find one of the things that schools like your company and others like it are trying to get through this wormhole so we can enable business and enable people to share information when they want to, but it's not in this totally disaggregated from the human being way that the current data broker industry is like doing its business like as an everyday thing. Are there any final thoughts about rights before we go on?
Well, I think just really quick, I want to just talk about privacy and anonymity. They're, in my mind, they're actually like slightly different things. And we want to be, the internet is a great place to be sort of anonymous, but many times you don't need to be anonymous, but you'd like a specific transaction to be sort of private to you. I do banking transactions online, and I have identity related to business websites and LinkedIn and networking and banking things. But Maybe I also, visit some sites that I don't want my work to know about, some weird gaming websites that I visit or something like that. And, I like StarCraft and League of Legends, and, maybe that's weird, for the line of business I'm in, right? Yeah. Get your minds out of the gutter. And so, I sort of want those things to be private and unlinked together. And I think that's a really, really important theme. Like with this whole, we're talking about building like the next, iteration of digital identity, because we need to balance like business and government regulation requirements around anti-fraud and compliance with consumer privacy. And I really believe that like we have the EFF here, and, there's not that many proponents on the privacy side that are like really actively saying like this is something that we need to do and value it. And even as consumers, I'm kind of ashamed of all of us because we don't really prioritize privacy in many of the things that we do. And maybe it's sort of a lack of like, we don't know that like all this data is being aggregated about us until sort of it's too late, and you're like, oh my god, how do you know that like I have a pimple on my leg and you just said that like I should buy this thing? Like you have, I don't know, like that doesn't make any sense, right?
So I think
I have
yes,
I
you
do have something to say on this, and I'm struggling with this because I want to make sure that I don't miss the point that we're trying to make here about anonymity and privacy, and just understand that there are situations and people who are in marginalized situations where their identity can get them killed. So it's really important because we don't understand sometimes the aggregation of that data that they want to have control over for their own safety and their own privacy, against what business thinks they're doing for the betterment of their economic framework. And so I want to make sure that we're not missing that piece of this. I know that that's a tricky conversation to have too, but it's really important that even in some of these instances that we're talking about, when, for example, someone's leaving a domestic violence situation, and they're trying to get someplace safe, and their information is being easily distributed. One example is the Social Security Administration, as people are trying to change their identities, change their names, change their Social Security numbers. There's third application processes that will still reveal what the new number is or the new name is, which in that instance, that data makes that person vulnerable.
Another example is like a human rights activist in a country where they don't have free speech, right? So if you say something online, and that's trackable back to you, and the government can subpoena or whatever, get it from whatever the ISP was. I think it's also important to remember anonymous and pseudonymous. I can never say that word. They're different things, right? So in the U.S., I mean, like the unmasking thing happens here all the time. Like, I think the biggest one in the news recently was the alt Twitter account. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think so.
They were
the alt
yeah,
agencies, and they tried to
they tried
take them to court.
The government tried to get Twitter to reveal the names and identifying information of an alt USCIS account. So they had the information. It wasn't really an anonymous account because Twitter probably knows who those people are, right? So, but sometimes you need a context where there's actually anonymous speech to be able to allow people to speak and have it be protected. So just following what you're saying.
So I think, it's so interesting where this panel is going. I think I told them we were going to have the conversation on stage and not before, so it's getting good. There's another side too, right? Like, I have been a victim of online trolls. They're not.
Sorry.
I knew it was you. Okay. And I think that, there's another side to this, is what is my right as a person to be able to go online and not be victimized by, like, not just like I'm calling you names because I don't like what you say, but I'm making death threats and putting your information up and getting you swatted by the cops, right? Like there's a level to which the activity in that that's driven to people who, for whatever they're doing online, is aggravating others to the point that they're actually not just saying mean things, but affecting their lives. So,
That's a pivot to me. So, so excuse me. I'm sorry. So I think that this is one of the challenging parts of this conversation about privacy, because this becomes the place where that data that is out there, that is available, because whether you posted a picture on Facebook, whether someone knows you're married, whether someone knows you have children, and in the context of our engagement, that data is then shared to either silence you or harass you or actually cause you physical harm. And so when we look at the combination of these things about our identity that can be breached, our identity that can be violated, our identity that our privacy can be violated in a way that people think is their freedom to do because it's just available. You can go through Spokio and get enough information about who their family dynamics are, and that information could be used in harm's way. And what are the protections for someone to fix that or deal with that without going back to the anonymous person who's doing that? Like, the person who's literally causing this harm is also the person who thinks that they're doing it out of free speech. And so the complication of making sure that we understand that sometimes that data aggregation or that data availability can be harmful, depending on how companies actually handle that situation. And I've dealt with many situations from Facebook, Twitter to Verizon, and the ways in which they handle it in bad ways, because they don't understand they look at data more as the way in which they get their economic framework for their company, using the user's data without exactly protecting them from the harm of the data that they collected.
Cool. Thank you. So I think we're actually getting close to inviting the audience to come up and ask us questions. We've got 15 minutes left.
Oh,
So
wow.
if
That went
anybody
fast.
wants to come and ask us questions. One of the things, it's right there. If you want to go, the mic, if you have a question. Yeah, that's what she, so one way we get answers to these questions is this type of conversations. But how should we get answers to these questions? How? That's one of the things we're supposed to answer.
Can I throw something out there?
Yes, please.
This might sound, I don't know if it's going to be trite or overly simplistic, but seeing lots of different people coming from different businesses and different walks, and you go through the startup area and people are working on different things related to digital identity. To me, it's really encouraging to see people identifying a problem. Kaliya was very early on in this whole kind of identity space. People identifying problems and throwing up solutions to see how consumers and consumer demand is responding. And I know that could be a long process. It could be very iterative. It might not be an immediate solve. There might be ways that market participants or governments can come in and solve an immediate problem that might have longer term ramifications. But to me, it's always really encouraging to see, disparate people throwing up solutions, throwing spaghetti against the wall, seeing what sticks, and consumers saying yay or nay, and having consumers vote with their feet. To me, that's just very exciting. And I think that's what's going on in this space. I mean, this is from a data and privacy perspective in the U.S., like you said, there's one side which is, wall off, everything should be private. The other side's like, no, it's the Wild West. And right now, from a legal perspective, it's almost Wild West. And that means that there's a lot of room for people to come in here and try to solve the problem from a developer standpoint, an entrepreneurial standpoint, test the market to see what works, see what people are responding to. So that's something that I see that's interesting.
Cool.
And I would just say to add to that, to also make sure that those groups are diverse and coming from different cultural perspectives and frameworks to understand how these things could be used in different ways in good ways in many instances, but also looking at some of the threat modeling and looking at it from a consumer perspective as well.
Cool. So,
Hi, I'm Niall with the UN, and we work a lot with governments, obviously. And sometimes governments are coming to us and saying, you know, we need to do an identity register. We want to do an identity card scheme. You've got to help us. But, for example, we don't recognize transgender people.
Yeah.
So in other words, that identity parameter is owned by us, the government. Nobody has the right to tell us that they're not a man or not a woman. We don't believe in atheism. It's punishable by death in our country. So you are X religion, whether you think so or not. That's a parameter of identity that government will argue is owned by them. Now, I don't agree with that at all, obviously. But I do recall there was a case went through the Supreme Court in Ireland, in my country, a couple of years ago, where a transgender woman had won the right to have her identity documents changed to reflect her gender identity. But she went further, and a case that went to the Supreme Court argued where she wanted the birth certificate actually changed to say she was in fact born female as opposed to male. Now, I actually don't know how that case ended out, but I do remember at the time there was this enormous public debate about the extent to which an individual has the right to tell a government that there's something absolutely fundamentally core about their identity data that they want changed, and what rights do the government have? Because I cannot think of a single case where I, as an individual, should be allowed tell the Irish government, I actually wasn't born in St. Anthony's nursing home in Limerick on the 21st of September 1970. That, I think, is a right. I think the government has a right to say you were born on that date in that location. Now, that's the most fundamental identity parameter anyone ever has. Where were you born? When? What name was given to you by your mother?
Yeah.
So I'd like to know, what do you feel government's rights are as opposed to government's responsibilities with regards to parameters of identity data?
So I have an opinion, but I'm going to let my... So, I mean, I think this also goes back to this question of who I am now and what I've done for the last 20 years in my adult life has nothing to do with where I emerged out of my mother's womb or on what particular day. Nothing. I'm actually pretty confused by why we're super obsessed about birth dates and places. In fact, there's cultures in the world like
It's for taxes.
no,
You have to
there's
know where to
lots
tax
of
the
reasons
person.
why, but like it's just kind of a myth. I mean, in college, I dated someone from Asia, and he was like, we record our birthdays based on like what month and phase of the moon. That's what our culture does. And then we make up birth dates because we have to interact with an international system that does it the way that folks in Europe decided to do it 300 years ago, right? So there's just a lot of cultural stuff in what you said, and we have to deal with it, right? Because states are coming to you asking these things, and they have a mental model in their head about what identity is and how it should work. So I'm going to let my panelists.
I think this relates to like any type of identity, like online, that there's information about you and you want to challenge. I think as a user or as a citizen, you should have the right to say, challenge it. You should be able to understand what's in your file, what is part of your identity, and to challenge that. And I think, I mean, I've never really thought about this birthday question. I feel like there could be some like reasons what you might want to have someone's birthday might be. I don't know. But yeah, voting is interesting. Like, or drinking or something like that. How do you enforce those types of laws that might be good for society that are based on age? But I mean, does everyone need that information? No. Does some people? Maybe. But I think if there is a birthday and you want to challenge it, I think you should have the ability to do that, and maybe they listen or not. But in terms of like your gender identification, I mean, those are just really, really different questions. And I think, like, personally, I don't think a government can tell you what about, like, some of those things are like, they're not, like, it's not a date that is provable. It's like, if you're saying it, then it's true. I don't know. So, but that's my personal.
Yeah.
I actually think it's fine for the government to just say whatever they want. If they only have one classification of gender and call it male, okay, fine. They can attest to that. Maybe no one in society should be actually valuing what the governments are saying, and we should look at other attesters of identity, whether it's self-attestation. If we say, "Hey, what's your gender?" and you say, "I'm a boy," I'm like, "Okay, cool, you're a boy." But I don't have to like look at like your birth certificate and say, "No, but they say you're a girl here on your thing." Like who do you trust, right? That's ultimately what it comes down to. Today, our trust framework is heavily based on attestation by a central government party who gives you an identity. I think that's going to change over time. Identity is going to be more organic. We're going to start to have more reputation-based identities and self-attestation-based identities that will actually be respected and utilized for different purposes. Now, on the government level, I mean, that gets into like a whole nother conversation. I mean, we should obviously lobby our governments to be more open-minded about different things. But there is some legacy there. As consumers and as businesses that consume government identities, we can look at their categories, but we don't necessarily have to apply them in how we service our customers, right? And we can ask, in addition to what the government says your gender is, what do you feel your gender is so we can better serve you? That's a question we can ask as a business, right? So I think, as I said, it's evolving, it's growing. And we're going to look at secondary and tertiary sources of attested identity.
There might be cases where you want to actually like hide stuff from your government. If like you are atheist and that is a crime, like you might not want them to know. But it seems like if the government is creating your identity for you, it's not even yours anymore.
Sure. Selectively private disclosure of that.
Then if the government's creating everyone's identities, it kind of undermines.
So true.
I just have one thing to say on this. I always have problems with the checkbox framework anyway, because the boxes that I have to check have nothing to do with my actual. Every time I check a box for someone, on a form, including Facebook, that won't let me check my ethnicity. I can't check that, but I can check everything else. And to understand that these check boxes are not my identity. They are imposed upon me not only by government, but by these companies who are trying to put me in some box that works for them for their data collection. And the truth is, that's part of the problem, because now their data collection is wrong, because that's not my identity, and that's not about the data in which I'm giving. So when the ads start coming, I can tell when my checkbox was checked and it was the wrong one, and they decided to push the data or share that data or sell that data on me, that has nothing to do with me. It was just a forced checkbox. So there's so many pieces to this and we don't have these conversations enough, to me, because there are clear indications of what facts are and how we as a society deal with those facts versus dealing with people. And I think as Matt said, I am the best person you should be talking to gather this data, to share this data, and understand why the data is important in any framework.
Matt, one more.
Yeah, I just want to jump in for 1 second and play devil's advocate on one issue that was brought up over the last, over the last 4 or 5 of us speaking. Take it away from government, and let's say there's a situation where I'm trying to get a loan from a bank, and we're living in a smart contract world, and I have to meet certain requirements, and those requirements are you have to know the address because I'm asking for a loan on that house. My FICO score needs to be X, the loan to value needs to be X, and my net income needs to be X. If I'm able to change attributes as I see fit, you could obviously run into a problem where if the company lending to me can't have faith that my FICO score is X, then how can they reasonably provide me a loan? And I don't know what the answer is. It just and again, that's a separate argument from government and just trying to figure out like what level of self claims can be made, and how would that work in the setting of commerce? Like, how could we just trust it if people could just be like, I'm this or I'm that? I don't know what the answer is, but I figured I'd pose it.
Part of it, what you said too at the beginning about what identity is your persistence as a being over time, right? And so then the question is, how is that how is that need to have persistence as a being over time in various systems supported and enabled, and does it have to be tracked back to these conventional systems that we have? And the answer is maybe not, but we'll see. So I want to let her ask us one final question, and then I think we'll be
I'm gonna proxy my final question to this guy.
well, maybe both of you ask your questions, and then we'll answer them,
Both
and then
of
we'll be
that.
done.
Yeah, do
Yes.
that.
Do that. 2 questions.
Okay.
Come on.
Okay.
Come on up.
Oh my God. Okay. Let me
Yeah.
knock my teeth out first. Okay. I'll do a quick fire then. I just wanted to know. So right now, privacy is being breached all over the place. All these stores and things, and people's privacy is getting breached. Do you think there'll come a point soon where individuals realize, like, hey, everybody's monetizing the crap out of all my data? And because, you know, like, I know that in tech, but it almost seems like no matter what happens, there's not an uprising from the individual. Do you think that it will happen soon? And like, what would cause it to happen where people go, hold on, I want to hold my identity?
So, and
And
ask
the
your
other question, come on.
Okay, we're gonna do them
2
both
at a
at the
time.
same
Yeah,
Yeah.
both of
Don't
them.
forget her
Faster.
question. It's a really important question.
Yeah.
We
I
want
kind of feel like
it's okay. You
this
got it.
should be like a drinks conversation, actually, because like I
could
really
do
want to
that
argue
later.
with so many of the things I heard today. But I actually think that you guys are kind of arguing with yourselves a little bit, because we started with this presumption and everyone kind of went down the line and said, who owns the identity? It's kind of a stupid question because of course you do. But what we're actually seeing as we look at specific cases and as we dig into them, that the individual doesn't get to decide by themselves, right? And so identity is this weird thing where you have a say, but there is a social construct, right? That the group, whatever it is in that moment, right, gets to have a say too, right? And so I think one of the challenges is that we talk about identity as one thing, and it's really thousands of things in different contexts, in different moments, at different times, with different people, with different institutions, and all of that. And so I just want to reflect that back to you guys, that I think that there's like a fundamental disconnect with where we started this conversation and where I feel like it ended up. And I'm Jamie Janrain. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Jamie. I don't think it's a disconnect. I just think it's all. I mean, very simple. It's all of those things. And in each different place that we happen to be in, and I'm going to go back to your, I'm sorry. But in each different place that we have to engage with a form of identity. But some of those identities are being forced upon us. It's not actually ours. And that's what this whole spectrum of conversation is about, because they all show up in different places. But how do we control that? And how do we have the rights to where, even if it's the government, even if it's a corporation, how do we have control over that and sort of do and all? I always find that when we have these conversations, there's always a either or. Like, people sit in this room and go either or, either or, either or. None of this is either or. It's and, all, plus, more, multiple. And that's the problem with us, because we want things to get in that checkbox. And that's the problem. So, and I'm sorry, and just in terms of your privacy piece, I don't know, because I feel like, from my perspective, I want us all to do an uprising, because there's too much of my privacy being violated on a daily basis. And that's not just because of what I do, but because of who I am. And those combination of things make my life very complicated, because there are constant attempts on violating my privacy. And so the question at this point is, who then is responsible for these breaches? But most importantly, at the end of the day, I don't think until people feel like they're at a place where they're not safe, that's when you'll see that.
You go and then I'll go.
Thank you. So I just wanted to piggyback on what
And then I'll
Shireen's-
go.
I wanted to piggyback on what Shireen said. So what Shireen just got at the end there is interesting, because this came up in a panel I sat on about a week and a half ago, and that is you can look at it around, are people going to have awareness? Are they going to get educated? Are they going to make a change, have an uprising, whatever? There's two overarching things. It's fear and greed.
Yes.
And there's people who have been wronged, either perceived to have been wronged, or were wronged and have their identity stolen, or think that pair of Nikes that follows around the internet is wrong, and they're indignant and they want to turn it off, so they go get disconnect or some other ad blocker. There's that kind of stuff. And then there's greed, which is how do you provide an economic incentive for people to, it becomes a waste of money for them not to take an action where they're going to benefit from using their data, or they're going to benefit from shoving that guy off from their data and then gaining some agency or control. And the challenge is we often get told that there needs to be education and more awareness and this and that, and I think that's all good stuff, and we try to do that with our company, and we try to participate in those ecosystems that exist out there. But generally speaking, the layperson walking around has lives, wives, health, wealth, mortgage debt, all sorts of different problems. Lumping on management and the value of data is really challenging for most people. So there needs to be those two key elements, one or the other, to happen to get people to change behaviors. And that's at least what we found, in our early stage.
In terms of Jamie's comment, is that right? I think there might have been a slight disconnect between what I've said in terms of or user rights or people's rights and what's actually happening online. And that's because I'm talking what it should be, not necessarily what it is right now. Because I think what you said earlier, it's kind of like a Wild West out there, and companies aren't always giving users the rights that we at EFF think that users should have, right? So that may be part of it. But I'm an advocate, so I'm looking forward. That's my goal. But then we're talking about how do we the checkboxes is the reality that we live in today, and that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And then in terms of your question,
privacy of
privacy, yeah, I think just knowledge and is one of the big things. After Snowden, a lot of people have gotten more engaged and care more about their privacy, right? And we just need to keep that going. It's something that we struggle with every day. Our activism director is wandering around here today too. I think she's moderating a panel on Wednesday. So you should go find her too and give her ideas, because that's what she thinks about every day.
Cool. Just real quick. Address her question first around, at what point, what's going to be the tipping point for consumers to realize that there's going to be this, vast intrusion on your privacy. There may not ever be one, or, I think we're going to just wake up one day and we're going to say, oh my God, this is a terrible situation. I think the problem is that we're going to, right now, pretty much all the data collection, it's not too malicious overall on the consumer side. But when you have the data store, you have the ability for somebody that could use the data in a very malicious way, whether it's, racial profiling, or I don't know, maybe we have some maniacal dictator president or something like that, and they decide to use the data for, something, right? And we don't know, and we're like, oh my God, how do you get all this data? And it's well, he's always had that data. We just never had a crazy guy that's using the data. So that might be sort of the tipping point. That might be the singularity. In terms of data privacy and but at that point it may be too late, right? We might have a technology advisor who runs a company doing artificial intelligence on data mining called Palantir. I don't know. Maybe it's too late already. Who knows?
You're not saying mass surveillance is okay, are you?
No, I'm saying that this is the tipping point for when we'll realize that we should have prioritized privacy, right?
Well, I think more so about threat modeling in the sense of the data itself. It's that conversation we always have. Is the data neutral? Technically, it is. It's how the data is used, and so I think it has more to do with if this data in this and collected in this form can be helpful or harmful. It's still a question I don't think we're actually talking about enough. And I think that the reason is the tipping point that I think we're talking about is there are more and more of us who that data is being used in a malicious way, right. and that once we start having more and more of those conversations, we'll start to see where we're losing ground and where honestly, I've been around from the beginning, and I always thought that, there was a utopia of what we were going to do online and in technology. I was like, well, this is good. We're going to do some good things with this. But the problem with that is I think everyone thought that, and no one thought about the people who would probably take these things and use them for bad. And so those are the big questions about identity, is that we have to look at all these things from all those perspectives.
Totally. So I think we're over time now, but what I'm hearing is that there's some next conversations that would be good. One is actually doing threat modeling, but about some of these happy visions we have about how identity could work here. and understanding them from a variety of perspectives. I think there's another conversation about what are the rights that we should have in a sort of aspirational, if we were to outline them and look ahead and go like, what are the rights we should have in 10 years? I want to name a few things. One is GDPR, which I'm sure will get bandied around a lot here, but like that's pretty radical, like sort of standing up for our rights. Like if we believe the governments represent their citizens and they're doing what they want, they were like, no, like we get our rights to our data, and we're gonna, I've said this in Europe on panels that to EU leaders, you guys are the only things big enough to stand up to Silicon Valley companies, so keep doing it, right? Like, who else was going to stand up to them and say no, except an entity that has 350 million people in it and the force of law behind it? And building on what you said, I think there is a kind of triangle of connection. There's who are we inside? How do we present ourselves to the world? And how does the world reflect us back to ourselves, right? And that's what we're still trying to figure out, like both in the face-to-face world as understandings of identities and identities that have been suppressed in our cultures are sort of surfacing, and how do we do this online in a way that is empowering to people and works for them? So I think does anyone else have any final thoughts before we close?
I think that was a good summary.
Okay. Well, I just want to say one thing. And I know that was a good close, but I didn't get to address the gentleman's question. I just
Okay.
want to say one thing.
No.
Well,
I cut you off.
no, it's fine. So, in terms of us being sort of contradictory to what we're saying, yes, a lot of what we're actually saying about evaluating the real environment today is that identity is sort of a very centralized thing, and currently a lot of consumers don't really own their identity today in this framework. The EFF, and others like myself believe that the consumer should own identity. I think the paradigm shift that's going to happen, that's rapidly happening, is the movement from a centralized identity to a decentralized self-sovereign identity. And you're going to see that adoption pick up both from a fraud, cybersecurity, and liability perspective, and for all the other reasons around privacy that we had mentioned on this panel. And I think in the future, hopefully we'll have this conversation in a not too distant future again, and we'll be talking about how cool all the private systems are for identification that are deployed in the market.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you, everybody.